For over 200 years, Jews like others have immigrated to the United States for a variety of reasons. Many came to escape oppression and religious persecution in their native countries, and others for economic opportunities. Some came to the state of Florida for the same reasons. The following stories will show you 4 different Florida Jewish families at 4 different times in Florida history, their reasons for coming here, and how they adapted to their new home. The first family that we will look at is an important one in our state's history. Moses Levy and later his son David had an impact on Florida even before it was a state.
Hello, I'm David Levy Yulee. I was the first United States Senator from Florida and the first Jewish person to serve in the U.S. Congress. But wait a minute, let's start at the beginning. I came to Florida with my dad in 1819, just before it became a United States territory. My dad, who was born in Morocco, had gone to the Caribbean, where he became a lumber merchant. Later, he decided to move to Florida and brought me with him. He had bought a large piece of land from Spain to develop a plantation in the area where the University of Florida is today. He wanted to bring immigrant Jews to settle there to work and study the Bible. He sent me to Virginia, where there were other Jews and I could get a Jewish education. When I came home, I was in my teens. My dad and I had lots of arguments. We didn't agree about anything. He was a religious Jew who studied the Torah, and though I never converted, I had stopped practicing Judaism. He was against slavery. He even wrote articles about it. I thought that slavery was necessary for our way of life, and so did my friends. He thought that my education was completed, and that now I should help him on the plantation. What I really wanted to do was study law, not work on the plantation. So I left the plantation and went to St. Augustine as an apprentice to a lawyer and stayed there to practice. I wanted to be a part of the excitement of helping this territory of Florida become a state. I worked very hard campaigning for statehood and helping to draft its first constitution. I was glad I did, because in 1845, Florida became the 27th state, and I was elected Florida's first U.S. Senator. There were people in Washington, D.C. who were unhappy that I was there because they did not like Jews. I officially changed my name from David Levy to David Levy Yulee, which was the family ancestral name in Morocco. I wasn't re-elected to the Senate in 1852, so I returned to Florida. I got together with a few other men, and together we built the first railroad that linked the east coast and west coast of the state. It went from Fernandina on the Atlantic Ocean to Cedar Key on the Gulf of Mexico. For the first time, produce and merchandise could be shipped across the state and not have to go all the way around Key West. I was re-elected to the Senate in 1858 and went back to Washington, where the differences between the North and South were becoming greater. I even wrote a letter about it to my friends back in Florida. Things got so bad by 1861 that I, along with the other Southern senators, resigned from the United States Senate. We helped to form a new Southern government, the Confederate States of America, which I served throughout the terrible war between the states that soon took place. After the war was over, I continued working on the affairs of the railroad and my property, which included a sugar mill at Homosassa. It is still there. The people of Florida honored me greatly. They named Levy County and the town of Yulee for me and my family. I'm proud to be part of the history of this state.
Let's meet the Dolinskis, the Jewish family who have lived in Florida the longest. They've been here for over 150 years. Members of this family have played a part in Florida history since they first came to the state.
Hello, I'm George Dolinsky. As far as I know, when I was born in 1857, I was the first Jewish boy born in Florida. There are descendants of my family still living here today, and I want to tell you about some of them. My father, Philip Dolinsky, came to Jacksonville, Florida from Prussia in 1845. He was young and looking for good opportunities in his new home. He was soon followed by my grandfather, Abraham, a political refugee, and my 8 aunts and uncles. Now, my grandmother had died during the very hard trip from Europe. Unfortunately, my grandfather and 2 of my uncles also died during the yellow fever epidemic in Jacksonville in 1857. That was the same year that I was born. They were buried in the state's first Jewish cemetery. Then our family fled from Jacksonville during the Civil War, when that city was under siege by the Union troops. We first moved to Tampa, then to Fort Meade, where Father played an important part in the development of that city during and after the Civil War. He had successful orange groves and a store and a boarding house. He served on many committees that worked to help the economic and social development of Fort Meade. He later went back to Jacksonville. I always have been so proud of my father's sense of honor. In his later years, after his crops froze 2 years in a row and yellow fever epidemics sent people fleeing from Jacksonville, his business, it was absolutely ruined. But he refused to take advantage of the bankruptcy laws, and he paid every one of his debts, although it left him penniless. My Uncle Morris, now he was quite a man also. He was younger than my father and fought in the Civil War. He was on the Confederate side. Now, after the war, he came back to Jacksonville, where he developed a successful carriage business. Not the ones for babies, the kind pulled by horses that people rode in. Everybody loved my Uncle Morris. He worked very hard to help many community groups and gave a lot of money to charities. He was mayor of Jacksonville from 1881 to 1883. He was also very active in the Jewish community and became the founding president of the city's first synagogue. My half-sister Gertrude was really ahead of her time. Many people thought she was quite eccentric. She was one of the first women lawyers in Florida and set up practice in Jacksonville. But men wouldn't go to a woman lawyer in those days. She finally had to give up and went to work as a legal secretary in Tallahassee. Later, she worked for Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward during his term as Florida governor. Broward County is named for him. There is a funny story about her at Governor Broward's inauguration. She was so busy before the inaugural ceremony that my wife, Bertha, offered to pack Gertrude's suitcases. She was careful to protect the silk roses on the big hat that Gertrude planned to wear for the ceremony. As she packed it, she rolled up her stockings and put them between the roses, and during the inauguration, it became obvious that Gertrude had not looked in a mirror when she dressed for the grand occasion. She could not understand why people looked at her so oddly. She didn't know that the rolled-up stockings were still there on her hat, protecting the roses. She eventually married a river steamboat pilot, and she was very happy. I guess she had the same sense of honor that our father did, because she took care of and supported her mother, my stepmother, until she died. We had other interesting relatives. My cousin, Mina Williams, she was the first Miss Florida. She was a part of Governor Perry's inauguration ceremonies in 1885. Another cousin, Ruby Diamond, spent her life working to benefit her hometown of Tallahassee, and Florida State University Auditorium bears her name. I could go on, but you get the idea. I think we have a terrific family.
We come now to a family with a very different story, but we will let Marcus Winkle tell us about it himself.
Hello, I am Marcus Joseph Winkle. I was born in the village of Blagonoshenko in Russia. My story begins when I was in my teens. In 1887, I received my draft notice from the Russian Tsar's army. It was terrifying for a Jew to serve in the army. In those days, We had no status as citizens and were forced to do the worst and most dangerous work. And if you were a religious Jew, as I was, it was hard to get anything to eat, as the army food was not kosher and therefore forbidden to me. My family immediately began to plan my escape. So they sent notice to the army that I had died of a high fever, and they held a funeral in the local cemetery. They buried me. Can you imagine being buried alive? It was awful. They made sure I had enough air to breathe, and as soon as it was dark, I dug my way out. My family had hidden some of my clothes, some food, and some money in a small Torah near the grave. I found everything, and that night began what turned out to be a 2-year trip to Palestine. I had to walk a good deal of the way. When I finally got there, the first thing I did was to go to a photographer to take my picture. I sent it back to Russia to my parents so they would know I was still alive. I became a sheep herder. At night, thieves often tried to steal some of the herd. I became a good watchman, but sometimes the thieves got away with some of the sheep anyway. Life was very hard in Palestine, which was ruled by Turkey in those years. I got sick with cholera, and I also lost my money when the bank failed. I finally gave up, took my Torah, and armed with a Turkish passport. How I got it is a whole other story that I don't have time to tell you now, and I went back to Russia. There, I was able to convince my family to follow me to America, where I had decided a Jew could live in peace as a Jew. They promised to come. I couldn't take the chance of waiting for them, as one of the neighbors recognized me, so I left again, this time to go to the United States. I still carried my Torah with me. My family soon followed. I liked the things I had heard about Florida when I arrived in New York, and I decided to move there. I settled in Moffett. That's near Zoffo Springs. You can find it on a map of Florida if you look really hard. I opened a lumber mill and did well, but I was lonely. I wanted to get married, but there were no Jewish girls in the area. So I went on a visit to New York City. There, I met Hannah Rutkowski, a religious Jewish girl. We married and came back to Moffett. We were very happy together, and we had children. It was hard to keep a religious Jewish home in a small town with no other Jews. Hannah had an experience that finally made up our minds to move. She had stepped on a rusty nail. One of the mill hands wrapped her foot in salt pork to draw out the poison. But Jews are forbidden to eat pork by our dietary laws. To Hannah, even having it wrapped around her foot was too much. So we moved to Jacksonville, which had, in the early 1900s, the largest Jewish community in Florida. We had a good life there and became active members of the community, even founding members of a new synagogue. Today, there are Winkle relatives all over Florida. The Torah that I carried from Russia to Palestine and then to Florida is now part of the permanent exhibit of the Jewish Museum of Florida. People from all over the world can know my story.
In 1959, another chapter of Jewish immigration to Florida began. The immigration from Cuba. Lena Becker did just that.
I was one of those immigrants, but let me start my story even before I was born. My grandparents had brought each of my parents to Cuba from Russia around 1917 after the communists took power in Russia and nationalized its economy. There was a Jewish community in Cuba, which grew bigger and stronger over the years, especially in Havana, which is the capital city. When they grew up, my parents, Solomon Becker and Clara Saranowski, met in Havana and married. My mother was a doctor, and my father had an import-export business. First, my sister and then I were born. We had a good life in Cuba. I loved my family, my school, my home, my friends, my nanny. They really meant a lot to me. In 1959, the life we knew, certainly my life, changed. The communists took control and nationalized the industries. People became afraid. During the 1960s, over 200,000 people left Cuba. among them 10,000 Jews. We were part of the Jewish migration, and like most, we came to Dade County, Florida. My parents had determined that we would have a better life in America. It took them 7 years to get permission to leave Cuba, but finally it came, and we boarded a special flight to Miami called a Freedom Flight. It was March 30, 1966. I'll never forget it. I think it was probably one of the worst days of my life. My parents and grandparents were happy. I wasn't. I was 14 years old. It was terrible to leave everything and everyone I knew and loved except my family. I was sad and confused. When we came to Miami, we had little money. We were forced to leave most of everything we owned in Cuba. Our resources were also limited. Friends of my parents let us live in their family room. All of us. It was pretty crowded in there. Eventually, I started school, and I found it to be huge. I kept getting lost in this school. I thought I knew English because I had studied it in Cuba, and boy, was I wrong. I couldn't understand one word people were saying. They spoke so fast and used slang that I never heard of. It was very confusing at first. I didn't have any friends, and I was really lonely. Finally, one day, I met a girl who was very nice, and we got to know each other and became good friends. And then things began to look a little better for me. My father got a job in a shoe store, which he later bought with a partner, and my mom had taken the Florida medical boards, which she passed, and began practicing medicine again. We moved into our own apartment and eventually bought a condominium. I graduated from Miami Beach Senior High School, then Miami-Dade Community College, then I went to Florida International University, and finally I received a master's degree in social work from Florida State University. Yes, I am a Seminole. One of the most sentimental days of my life came in late 1979 when I became a citizen of the United States. I did this while I was in Tallahassee studying. Today, I'm the program director of the Cuban American National Council. We do educational and service programs in South Florida. Some people are always amazed to find out that my background is both Cuban and Jewish, as though I couldn't be both at the same time. But you know what? I'm really proud to call myself a Cuban, Floridian, American Jew.
People all over the world have struggled and strived to make a better life for themselves, their families, and their countrymen. The four people you've just met, David Levi-Yuli, George Dolinsky, Marcus Winkle, and Alina Becker, and their families did just that. Their stories could have been any family's, even yours. They were among the many pioneers, the many Jewish pioneers, who helped build this great state of ours, Florida.